How does a racing aircraft traveling faster than most commercial airliners suddenly become uncontrollable? How does an aircraft built for speed transform into a disaster in less than 5 seconds? And how does a single piece of metal trigger one of the deadliest airshow accidents in American history? There was no mid-air collision, no engine explosion, no fire before impact. What happened instead unfolded at nearly 500 miles per hour. And to the thousands watching that afternoon, it still looked like part of the show, until within seconds it became a disaster. Because the danger at Reno was not hidden inside bad weather or mechanical failure. It was built into the edge of the performance itself. And on September 16, 2011, that edge finally broke. Welcome to Tragic Flights, where we go beyond the headlines to examine what really happened in aviation disasters. So if you enjoy detailed aviation storytelling, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. To understand what happened at Reno in 2011, you first have to understand what air racing actually is. Because this was not a commercial aviation, military combat, and not even a typical air show performance. The National Championship Air Races in Reno, Nevada were built around one thing: speed. Every year, highly modified aircraft gather at Reno Stead Airport to compete in low-altitude races across the Nevada desert. Pilots flew around a closed circuit marked by pylons positioned across open terrain. The objective was simple: complete the course faster than everyone else. Unlike traditional aerobatic performances, Reno racing pushed aircraft into sustained high-speed turns lap after lap. Pilots were not simply demonstrating maneuvers, they were competing aggressively against one another, while flying aircraft near their performance limits, and at those speeds, tiny mistakes could become catastrophic, like a turn taken too sharply, a minor mechanical problem, or even a brief loss of control. Any one of those situations could quickly become catastrophic. At Reno, pilots had very little time to react before problems escalated, especially in the unlimited class. The unlimited category represented the fastest and the most dangerous group in the competition. Most of the aircraft were heavily modified World War II fighters, machines originally designed for combat decades earlier. The P-51 Mustangs, Sea Furies, Warbirds were rebuilt and transformed into racing aircraft, but many of them no longer resembled the aircraft that originally left military factories during World War II. Because now, the engines were upgraded, airframes were stripped down, and everything now centered around performance. At Reno, speed was not just encouraged. It was engineered into every part of the aircraft. Pilots wanted tighter turns, higher acceleration, less drag, more power. And over time, some aircraft evolved far beyond their original military configurations. Because in air racing, victory is often decided by seconds, or fractions of seconds. That pressure pushed both pilots and machines toward the edge of what remained aerodynamically safe. And unlike most forms of aviation, Reno racing happened directly in front of spectators. With thousands gathered each year to watch vintage warbirds scream across the desert floor at nearly unimaginable speeds, the sound alone was unforgettable. Massive piston engines roared across the valley, propellers tearing through the air with violent force. Aircraft passed so low and fast that the ground itself seemed to shake beneath the crowd. For aviation fans, Reno was legendary, not only because of the aircraft themselves, but because of how close people could witness them operating at maximum performance. There were no clouds separating the audience from the action. No distant contrails high above the earth, only raw speed unfolding directly in front of them. It was a spectacle, competition, engineering, and danger combined together. Because air racing did not hide risk from the audience. In many ways, risk was part of the attraction. And on September 16, 2011, that danger became real. Because one aircraft entering the course that afternoon was already carrying problems nobody could see. The aircraft involved in the crash was a heavily modified North American P-51D Mustang known as the Galloping Ghost. Originally built during World War II, The P-51 Mustang had earned legendary status as one of the most effective fighter aircraft of the war. It is fast, powerful, and capable of long-range escort missions deep into enemy territory. But decades later, aircraft like these found a second life in air racing, and Galloping Ghost had been transformed extensively for speed competition. Its wings had been clipped shorter to reduce drag. The fuselage had been modified. Even the systems had been altered to improve racing performance. The aircraft no longer operated within the same aerodynamic margins its original designers intended during wartime service. At the controls was 74-year-old Jimmy Leeward, an experienced air racer and former Hollywood stunt pilot who had spent years around high-performance aircraft. Leeward was respected within the racing community. He understood the risks involved in Reno racing, and like many competitors there, he accepted those risks as part of the sport itself. To pilots like Leeward, Reno represented more than competition. It represented mastery over machines operating at the very edge of control. But edge-of-control aviation leaves little room for error. And aboard Galloping Ghost, hidden vulnerabilities had already begun forming before the race started. Because the aircraft had undergone years of modifications. Some are documented, some are not fully understood, and some that investigators would later determine may have reduced the aircraft's overall aerodynamic stability. At racing speeds, small changes can produce massive consequences, especially when the aircraft is already operating under extreme stress. And on the afternoon of September 16th, Galloping Ghost prepared to enter one of the most dangerous environments possible for a modified warbird. Low altitude, high speed, tight turns, minimal recovery time. The exact conditions where even a tiny mechanical failure could become fatal within seconds. On the afternoon of September 16, 2011, thousands of spectators gathered at Reno Stead Airport expecting speed. Families filled the grandstands. Aviation enthusiasts prepared their cameras. Veteran race fans watched aircraft thunder across the Nevada desert just as they had for years before. For people there, Reno was more than an air race. It was a tradition, a celebration of raw aviation performance where heavily modified warbirds pushed themselves to extraordinary limits only a short distance above the ground. But nobody in the crowd realized that within minutes, panic would replace excitement across the airfield. And then, Galloping Ghost entered the course. The modified P-51 accelerated rapidly around the race circuit, lap after lap, at extraordinary speed. Witnesses later described the aircraft moving aggressively across the course. Fast even by Reno standards, the Mustang banked hard through turns, while remaining dangerously close to the ground. And at those speeds, the aircraft was subjected to huge aerodynamic forces. Every turn increased structural stress across the airframe. Every correction placed additional pressure on the control surfaces. And every second demanded absolute precision from both machine and pilot. Because Reno racing left very little room for error. Pilots were operating aircraft near their performance limits, while flying only a short distance above the desert terrain. If something goes wrong, then there won't be time to recover. Still, from the outside, the race appeared normal. Nothing visible suggested that disaster was only moments away. But deep within the aircraft's tail section, a critical component was approaching failure. The left elevator trim tab, a relatively small piece attached to the aircraft's elevator system. Under normal conditions, trim tabs help pilots maintain stable control by adjusting aerodynamic pressure across flight surfaces during flight. And aboard Galloping Ghost, investigators would later determine that parts of the trim tab assembly had become vulnerable after years of stress, vibration, and racing modifications. At Reno racing speed, the aerodynamic forces acting against that system were enormous. And then, during the race, the trim tab suddenly separated from the aircraft. What happened next unfolded faster than the human body could even react. Witnesses would later describe the next few seconds as surreal. At first, many people struggled to understand what they were seeing, because the moment the trim tab detached, Galloping Ghost suddenly pitched upward with violent force. At nearly 500 miles per hour, the aircraft climbed aggressively into the sky as enormous aerodynamic forces overwhelmed the Mustang almost instantly. Some spectators believed the pilot was performing an unusually steep maneuver. Others thought the aircraft was attempting to recover from turbulence. But inside the cockpit, the situation had already become catastrophic. Investigators later estimated that the aircraft may have subjected him to forces approaching 17 Gs, which is enough to incapacitate a person almost instantly. And at that level of force, the human body struggles to keep blood flowing to the brain. As vision begins narrowing within seconds, consciousness can disappear almost immediately, and basic control of the aircraft becomes nearly impossible. Although the aircraft was still moving at racing speed, still under engine power, but now it was effectively uncontrolled. The violent pitch-up also placed enormous stress on the aircraft itself. One of the wings experienced structural overload during the maneuver. Pieces of the aircraft separated as the Mustang continued climbing and rolling through the air. The aerodynamic stability rapidly deteriorated, and at Reno racing altitude, there was almost no space available for recovery. The aircraft was flying low to the ground at extremely high speed. There was little time for the pilot to regain control, because the aircraft had rolled, nosed downward, and began descending directly toward the spectator area. For people watching from the stands, confusion quickly turned into horror. Many spectators initially believed the aircraft was still part of the race, or that the pilot was attempting some form of emergency correction. But within moments, it became painfully clear that something had gone terribly wrong, because it was no longer flying a controlled racing path. It was diving directly toward the crowd. There was almost no time for anyone on the ground to react. The galloping ghost descended rapidly toward the spectator area at tremendous speed. The aircraft was still moving at tremendous speed as it dropped out of the sky, and at approximately 4:30 p.m. local time, the Mustang impacted the ground. The collision was catastrophic. The aircraft struck with extreme force, sending debris, dust, and fragments of wreckage across the viewing area as smoke erupted upward from the impact zone. For a brief moment, many spectators froze in shock. Only seconds earlier, people had been watching the race unfold normally. Engines roaring overhead, aircraft circling the pylons, crowds focused on speed and competition. Now, the grandstands had become the center of a mass casualty disaster. Emergency responders rushed toward the impact site almost immediately. Medical crews began treating injured spectators across the area, while race officials attempted to clear the scene and stop ongoing flight operations. Witnesses later described confusion spreading throughout the airfield as people tried to understand what had just happened. Some searched for family members and friends, while others attempted to help the injured before emergency teams fully arrived. The scale of the destruction quickly became apparent. Jimmy Leeward was killed instantly in the crash. 10 spectators also lost their lives, and dozens more suffered injuries ranging from broken bones and severe trauma to life-altering wounds caused by debris and impact forces. What had started as an afternoon air race in the Nevada desert had transformed into one of the deadliest airshow accidents in United States history. And in the aftermath of the disaster, investigators now faced a critical question. How could an experienced pilot flying one of the most famous aircraft at Reno suddenly lose control during what initially appeared to be a normal racing pass? Because from the outside, the race appeared completely normal, until a tiny component failed and triggered a catastrophe nobody saw coming. Investigators quickly realized this was not a simple pilot error. Something inside Galloping Ghost had failed catastrophically. Race footage, maintenance records, aircraft modifications, and aerodynamic data. Early evidence quickly pointed toward the elevator trim tab failure. Video recordings captured showed the left trim tab separating from the aircraft moments before the violent pitch-up occurred. But investigators soon discovered the accident involved far more than a single broken component. Galloping Ghost had undergone extensive racing modifications over many years. Some of those modifications altered the aircraft's original aerodynamic behavior significantly. Its wings had been shortened, its weight was reduced, and several parts of the aircraft had been altered to make the Mustang faster around the Reno course. But those changes also affected how the aircraft handled at extreme speed. It was determined that the aircraft no longer behaved exactly like the original P-51 Mustang designed during World War II. One discovery became especially important during the investigation. The right elevator trim tab had previously been fixed into place instead of operating normally. That change altered how aerodynamic forces were distributed across the aircraft's control surfaces during high-speed racing flight. Investigators also found problems involving hardware connected to the trim tab assembly itself. Over time, stress, vibration, and racing conditions may have weakened parts of the system. And when the left trim tab finally separated during the race, the result was immediate. The aircraft pitched violently upward. Massive G-forces overwhelmed the pilot. Aerodynamic stability rapidly deteriorated, and at such low altitude, there was almost no chance of recovery. The investigation ultimately concluded that the crash resulted from the failure of the left elevator trim tab assembly during high-speed racing flight. But beneath that conclusion was a broader reality. Galloping Ghost had gradually evolved far beyond the aircraft originally designed decades earlier during World War II. And at Reno, those shrinking safety margins finally collapsed. But the disaster also forced aviation officials to confront a disturbing reality about air racing itself. In the aftermath of the crash, the future of Reno Air Racing itself suddenly came into question. Because the disaster forced difficult conversations not only about mechanical failure, but about the limits of performance itself. Because air racing has always existed close to danger. Pilots intentionally push aircraft to extreme speeds. Aircraft endure stress far beyond ordinary flight operations. And machines originally built decades earlier continue operating in one of the harshest aerodynamic environments possible. After the crash, safety procedures at Reno changed significantly. Spectator distances were re-evaluated, course layouts were modified, aircraft inspections increased, and even race operations faced renewed scrutiny across the aviation community. But beyond the immediate tragedy, the crash also became a reminder of something aviation history has shown repeatedly. As we all know, catastrophic failures do not always begin with massive explosions or dramatic warnings. Sometimes, they begin with a small piece of metal under enormous stress. A single failure, a fraction of a second, and an entire system falls apart faster than anyone can react. At Reno, thousands came to watch aircraft demonstrate speed, precision, and control. But on September 16, 2011, the limits of that control became visible to everyone watching. 11 lives were lost that day. Dozens more were injured. And one of aviation's most dangerous sports was forced to confront the cost of operating at the edge of performance. Because in aviation, speed can inspire awe, but speed also reduces time to react, recover, and sometimes, time to survive. Forever remembering the victims of the 2011 Reno Air Races tragedy. This is Tragic Flights. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story.